Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really important, though, let's be honest, quite challenging topic. We've gathered a stack of material government reports, investigative journalism, research papers, all focusing on child protection and the deeply disturbing issue of organized child sexual abuse in England.
That's right. And our goal here is really to try and cut through all that information, pull out the essential insights for you.
Yeah.
We need to understand the nature of this abuse. Look honestly at, where systems have failed historically, see what the government was already doing before recent events, and explore the political dynamics that led to this fresh push for a new national inquiry.
It is heavy subject matter, absolutely. But it's essential. If you want to be genuinely informed, we're going to guide you through what these sources reveal about what happened, what's been tried, and why, why this issue has surged back into the political spotlight, especially after previous big investigations. Let's dive in. So, drawing from these reports, these analyses, how is organized child sexual abuse, OCSA, how's it described in England? What do we need to grasp right at the start?
Well, the material makes it really clear this is a grave and complex concern. OCSA isn't just isolated incidents. It involves networks, groups, actively exploiting vulnerable children.
Right.
And the research within these sources, it breaks these networks down into a couple of key types, which is actually quite an important distinction to make.
Okay, so walk us through those types. What patterns are the sources identifying?
So the first one is often referred to as network abuse. Now, this typically involves offenders who are not related to the children. Extrafamilial is the term used.
Okay.
But they share a common sexual interest in exploiting kids. These networks, they often deliberately target vulnerable teenagers, sort of drawing them in.
And this is the kind of thing where we've heard about those devastating cases in the news, right? Like the big scandals. Rotherham?
Exactly. Yeah, the reports point directly to these high-profile cases, including Rotherham, where the scale was just immense. One source explicitly mentions up to 1,400 girls were sexually abused there.
1,400. Goodness.
Yeah. And a characteristic of this type, according to the material, is that while you have a high number of victims involved overall, some might only have limited contact, whereas others become trapped, long-term in these networks, horrific periods.
That level of victimization is just, it's staggering. And the second type you mentioned?
The second pattern described is familial organized abuse. And this is, it's profoundly disturbing, too. It involves these deep-seated cultures of sexual abuse within families.
Within the family itself.
Yes. And here, the abuse involves not just family members, but also individuals from outside the family who are sort of brought into this abusive environment. The sources note that parents, particularly incestuous fathers, are often central perpetrators in these situations.
So it's still organized, still a system, but the context is fundamentally different. It's inside the home, the family structure.
Precisely. The scale tends to be smaller in terms of the sheer number of victims compared to maybe large street networks, but the impact, it's often described as far more intense, far more damaging.
How so?
The material talks about a comparatively small number of victims, but notes the abuse is extensive. It's characterized by early initiation, it rapidly progresses to serious abuse, and there's a high intensity and prolonged duration. It's just deeply embedded trauma.
So two distinct patterns, both horrific, highlighted in the reports. Now, there's a point the material makes about the perpetrators, their demographics. That seems to challenge some common public narratives, especially the ones that have dominated certain headlines.
Yes, and this is where the insights become really crucial and, frankly, sometimes uncomfortable. While it's true, and the sources acknowledge this, that many perpetrators in the high-profile grooming scandal cases, the ones that got national attention, were of Pakistani heritage.
Right, that's what was widely reported.
It was. But the broader body of research, the reports cited in the material you looked at, they present a more complex picture.
Okay, and what is that picture? What does the wider research actually say?
Well, the material points out that reliable reports have now long indicated that white men are responsible for most group-based child sexual abuse.
Wow. Okay, that statistic that white men are responsible for most group-based CSA, that's a really powerful counterpoint to the focus we often hear.
It is.
It really underscores the complexity the sources are insisting on, showing this isn't an issue confined to or defined by just one specific ethnic group. It's a much broader societal problem. It involves multiple forms, multiple types of perpetrators.
Absolutely. And understanding that nuance right from the sources is vital if you want the complete picture.
Okay, let's move on to the history here. The reports, they're pretty unflinching about past failures to protect children.
Huh.
What does the material highlight as the major systemic breakdowns?
Yeah, the reports detail significant long-standing failures by authorities, evidence of abuse patterns in places like Rotherham, for instance. It was apparently collected as early as the early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
Yes. Yet, according to the analysis in the material, crucial signs were missed to investigate and prosecute. Just missed.
Missed signs. But why? Was it just oversight or something deeper, more systemic going on?
The material definitely points to systemic issues. A fundamental problem identified was that victims were, and this is a quote, routinely dismissed and disbelieved.
Just not taken seriously.
Not taken seriously. And critically, connections between separate accusations, patterns of abuse by the same networks or individuals, they were rarely made. The dots just weren't joined up across different cases or even sometimes within the same agencies.
That failure to connect the dots, and even worse, the dismissal of victims that comes through so strongly in the material. I mean, I read some truly heartbreaking accounts from victims in the sources we looked at.
Yes. The victim testimonies included in some of these reports are absolutely searing. Some victims reported that the police, for example, tragically attributed their abuse, their injuries, to their own lifestyle choices.
Their lifestyle choices. For a child being abused.
Can you imagine? The reports note this reflected deeply negative, judgmental attitudes, using just appalling terminology like lifestyle choices, liar, attention seeker, when describing vulnerable children who needed help.
To attribute a child's abuse to their lifestyle choices. I mean, that quote alone seems to just perfectly encapsulate the kind of systemic failure and the sheer disbelief that the sources describe. It's just horrific.
It really is.
So given that terrible history of failures, the reports also detail the government's responses, the efforts to reform child protection. And many of these were initiated before this recent push for a new inquiry, right? Often stemming from a previous major investigation.
That's correct. Yeah, much of the government's acknowledged response and its reform agenda have been driven by recommendations from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or ICSA.
ICSA, right. That ran for years.
It did, a significant period, 2014 to 2022. And its final report, as the sources highlight, it revealed fundamental systemic failings right across institutions.
And how did the government respond to ICSA's findings back then?
Well, the material indicates the government formally accepted the need to act on almost all of ICSA's recommendations. They publicly framed their response not as, the final word, but as a necessary beginning to make sure institutions learn from the past and to provide better support for victims moving forward.
Okay, so what kind of concrete actions or planned reforms are mentioned in the sources? Things that were already underway or accepted before this recent announcement of a new inquiry?
There's actually quite a range of initiatives detailed. On the criminal justice side, for instance, efforts were underway to improve reporting rates, increase charges related to this abuse.
Okay.
This included funding for dedicated analysts focused specifically on child sexual exploitation and abuse, and promoting best practices among police forces. There are mentions of specific investments like £2 million for programs like the VKPP, which supports policing in this area.
And what about support for the victims themselves? That must have been a major focus for ICSA.
Absolutely vital. The material points to legislative efforts like the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which was introduced back in March 2023. That was designed to give victims a stronger voice, improve their experience within the justice system.
How so?
Well, it aimed to place a duty on commissioning bodies to actually collaborate better on providing support services. There's also mention of increased funding for victim support figures, like an additional £6.6 million in June 2022 are cited, and significant ongoing funding like $21 million per year for the Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Fund.
And getting more specialist support workers.
Exactly. The goal was also to significantly boost the number of specialist workers like independent sexual violence advisors, ISVAs, and domestic violence advisors, IDVAs, targeting over 1,000 of them by 2024-25. Plus, models aimed at making the process less traumatic for children, like the Child House model, were also being promoted.
Access to records, that's another critical issue, isn't it? For victims trying to piece together what happened, maybe seek justice or support later on.
It's a huge point the sources emphasize. The government accepted the importance of victims being able to access records about their abuse or their time in care. They stated engagement with the Information Commissioner's Office was underway to develop a code of practice for this.
But there are legal rights already.
Yes. Victims already have a legal right to access their personal data under UK GDPR. And the sources highlight some specific data retention periods that apply to child records, like 25 years for education records, a minimum of 30 years for NHS sexual assault records, and case files for children in care being kept until they turn 75.
Wow, okay. And what about redress or compensation for the institutional failures that allowed this to happen?
Right. So the government, based on ICSA, stated they accept the need to introduce a redress scheme to acknowledge the institutional failures. The exact details were pending stakeholder consultation, apparently. They also committed to consulting on potentially changing the scope and time limits of the existing criminal injuries compensation scheme to better account for things like online abuse and situations involving unspent convictions.
And mandatory reporting. That was a key ICSA recommendation for people working with children. Where did the government stand on that?
The material notes the government stated they accept the need for mandatory reporting and would implement a mandatory reporting regime for child sexual abuse. This policy change was planned, but it was going to be informed by a public consultation, starting with a call for evidence first.
Online safety, too, obviously critical, given how much abuse happens online now.
Yes. The Online Safety Bill, introduced way back in March 2022, is mentioned as a major piece of legislation. The aim stated was to make the UK the safest place online. It puts duties on tech companies to remove illegal content, like child sexual abuse material, and requires them to protect children from harmful content and activity.
And one last thing mentioned was professional registration for staff in children's homes.
That's right. The sources indicate the government was also exploring proposals for mandatory registration of staff in those kinds of residential settings, children's homes, youth secure estates, that sort of thing.
Okay, so the material paints this picture. A major independent inquiry, ICSA, finishes in 2022. The government accepts many recommendations, outlines numerous reforms and actions across justice, victim support, records, compensation, mandatory reporting, online safety. A lot of activity. And yet, despite all of this, the sources tell us the calls for a new national inquiry just didn't stop.
That's the critical turning point the reports highlight. Yeah, despite the exhaustive work of ICSA, 7 years of it, and the government's response, figures mentioned in the sources, including victims like Fiona Goddard and someone identified just as Anna, they felt that the previous efforts, particularly the localized inquiries, just hadn't gone far enough. They didn't feel it captured the full, often national scale of these organized abuse networks.
They felt the fundamental questions weren't answered.
Exactly. As one source quotes, they desperately sought to understand why so often authorities fail to protect vulnerable girls. Local inquiries just felt insufficient to really expose the national networks, the systemic failures across different areas. So the demand for a new comprehensive national inquiry, it just kept building through campaigning, through public pressure.
And this is where the sources introduce a really significant recent political dynamic and the involvement of external figures that seem to heavily influence the public and political conversation.
Yes, this section of the material really delves into how external interventions can dramatically impact domestic political issues. The sources highlight the activity of figures like Elon Musk on his platform X as having significantly amplified the discourse and ultimately influenced the policy response to this grooming gangs scandal, as it was often termed.
How did that manifest? What does the analysis in the report say?
Well, the analysis describes Musk's activity on X as creating, and this is a quote, turmoil in British politics. It says it convulsed the body politic and played a major role in dominating the news cycle and actually setting the terms of debate around this specific issue.
And the sources point to specific actions he took on the platform. They name things.
They do. The material notes he used X to condemn Starmer, the Labour leader, and made various allegations against the Labour Party leadership regarding the issue. Some of these claims the sources identify as false or misleading. The analysis also points out his support for figures like Tommy Robinson, who he apparently portrayed as a brave truth-teller, according to one source, and Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK.
And the sources also try to give some insight into why this external intervention had such a big impact. What was it tapping into?
This is really key, I think, to understanding the political dynamic described. The analysis suggests Musk's interventions were effective because they tapped into and amplified pre-existing tensions. The material describes the issue itself as having been used as a culture war issue, often attempting to link the abuse specifically to immigration and alleging political cover-ups driven by a fear of appearing racist.
Right, that narrative was definitely present.
Yes, and the sources explicitly note that this issue provided ammunition to Reform UK. The analysis describes Musk's actions as possessing chaotic power and characterizes them as a definite attempt to shape international politics and push it toward libertarianism and ethno-nationalism. So it positions his involvement not just as commentary, but as a deliberate intervention into the political landscape surrounding this sensitive issue.
So you have this persistent campaigning by victims and advocates, meeting this wave of really intense external political pressure, amplified through social media, bringing the issue roaring back into the headlines. What was the outcome?
Well, directly following this period of intensified pressure and campaigning, on June 14th, 2025, the British government announced it would indeed hold a new national inquiry into organized child sexual abuse.
So the material really presents this as a direct result of that convergence of factors. The timing seems very close.
The timing is certainly presented that way in the sources, yes. Prime Minister Keir Starmer accepted the recommendation for a judge-led inquiry, which came from an independent reviewer, Louise Casey, who's mentioned in the reports.
And the stated aim of this new inquiry, as reported in the material, feels pretty significant given the context we've just discussed.
It absolutely does. The sources indicate a key focus of this new inquiry will be to understand how, quote, fear of racism and institutional failures affected justice. This directly addresses those sensitive political dimensions that were so heavily amplified in the lead up to the announcement.
There was a quote, wasn't there, from the Conservative Party response cited in the material that speaks very directly to that focus.
Yes, the sources quote the Conservative Law and Order spokesman, Chris Philp, stating quite explicitly, "Those in authority deliberately covered up the systematic rape of thousands of girls. Because the perpetrators were mainly of Pakistani origin, they thought race relations were more important than protecting young girls."
That's a very direct statement.
It is. And the quote continues, calling for truth and accountability for those responsible for any cover-ups. This quote, presented in the sources, starkly illustrates the specific narrative and the focus that some political stakeholders are demanding this new inquiry address head-on.
So, based on everything in this stack of material, we've traced a really complex, deeply troubling picture. We've seen the different forms, the devastating scale of organized child sexual abuse, the documented history of systemic failures within institutions meant to protect children, the significant volume of reforms and actions the government was already undertaking based on ICSA.
Yeah, a lot was already in train.
And then this convergence of persistent victim advocacy and intense external political pressure, amplified by figures like Elon Musk leveraging these culture war narratives, all culminating in the announcement of this new national inquiry.
That's the story the sources tell, and it shows that while the government had already committed to numerous changes from ICSA improving victim support, access to records, mandatory reporting, online safety, all of that.
Right.
This new inquiry signals a willingness, perhaps necessity given the pressure, to revisit those institutional failures, but with a very specific lens this time.
And as the sources make clear, that lens explicitly includes delving into that really difficult question. How did the ethnicity of perpetrators and, crucially, the fear of being labeled racist, how might that have impacted the pursuit of justice in the past? It seems like a direct response to the specific pressures and narratives highlighted in the material.
Exactly. The hope, certainly as stated by those advocating for it, is that this will finally uncover the full truth and hopefully lead to lasting change this time.
Okay, so here's something to really think about. Drawing on all these insights from the sources, we've seen the history, right? Major inquiries like ICSA, detailed government responses, but also analysis suggesting that even with the best intentions, actually implementing recommendations from these huge inquiries can face significant implementation challenge. As one source puts it, it's hard to make it stick.
Yeah, that's a well-documented issue with inquiries generally.
So now consider the intense political dynamics, those very specific politically charged narratives that seem to play such a big role in pushing for this new inquiry right now. Given that whole context, what will truly be the measure of this inquiry's success? Is it going to be the potentially groundbreaking recommendations it makes on paper? Or will it ultimately be judged solely on the tangible, difficult-to-achieve changes that actually make it from paper into practice, into protecting children better? It's definitely something worth mulling over after this deep dive.